Who authorized him to touch that map? The question cracked across the briefing room like a rifle report, sharp enough to silence the low murmur of admirals, commanders, and intelligence officers gathered beneath the cold glow of red tactical lights. At Pacific Fleet headquarters, where every word carried weight and every movement followed protocol, interruption was a kind of sacrilege. Yet there stood an old man at the edge of the illuminated operations table, one weathered hand resting beside a chain of islands marked in grease pencil, his finger hovering over a narrow blue corridor as though he had seen that water before. Commander Ethan Cole turned from the projection wall with the rigid disbelief of a younger man who trusted rank more than memory. 32 years old, polished shoes gleaming against the waxed deck, uniform pressed to knife-edge perfection, he crossed the room in clipped steps that echoed off steel bulkheads. "Sir," he said, though the word held no respect, "this is a restricted strategic briefing. Civilians do not revise fleet routes." A few officers exchanged glances. Some looked amused. Others irritated. The old man did not move. His faded field jacket, olive drab worn almost gray at the seams, looked out of place among ribbons and digital displays. A frayed patch clung to one shoulder, nearly erased by time. His silver hair caught the fluorescent light, but his eyes remained fixed on the map. Calm. Unblinking. As if Ethan Cole's indignation were weather passing over open water. "That channel funnels cross-current," the old man said quietly. His voice was low, rough as gravel under boots. "Your destroyers would drift 3 degrees starboard in heavy swell." A lieutenant at the back gave a short nervous laugh. Someone muttered that the visitor had wandered into the wrong room. Ethan stepped closer, jaw tightening. "You're interrupting a classified operation based on, what? A hunch?" The old man finally looked at him. Pale blue eyes, steady as winter sky. "Not a hunch. Just that. Nothing more." The room seemed to shrink around the silence that followed. On the projection screen, the digital ocean glowed cobalt and black. Somewhere above, air handlers hummed like distant rotors. Ethan reached past him and jabbed at the map. This route was built by wargaming software and reviewed by 3 commands. "You don't walk in here and second-guess it." The old man's hand rose and tapped one tiny reef marker almost no one had noticed. That reef wasn't charted right in '68 either. A few heads turned. One older captain froze almost imperceptibly. Ethan saw it and mistook it for support. His confidence sharpened. "Enough," he said. "Who let you in this room?" But the old man had already leaned over the glowing chart, tracing the alternate lane with one finger, like a pilot recalling old currents by instinct. It was not defiance. It was something stranger. Ownership. A young operations officer near the communications console felt a knot tighten in his chest. Something about the old man's posture, the way he studied the map without seeking approval, carried a familiarity no civilian should possess. Yet before anyone could speak, Ethan's voice rose louder, harder, built for humiliation. "Step away from the table, now." The old man straightened slowly. His gaze lingered on the route another second, then he said, almost to himself, "That route killed men once." The room held still. Even the projector fan seemed to hush. Ethan scoffed. "And how exactly would you know that?" The old man's lined face did not change. But something old moved behind his eyes, a tide returning after decades out. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he answered, "Hammer 6 learned it the hard way." And in the red-lit silence of Pacific Fleet Command, a name long buried slipped into the room like a ghost. The words did not echo, yet they seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken. Hammer 6. No one in the briefing room moved. The tactical display still cast its cold red glow across polished brass and dark blue uniforms, but something had shifted beneath the rituals of command. Commander Ethan Cole stared at the old man as though he had just heard a language no academy had taught him. Then he laughed, too quickly, too sharp. It was the laugh of a man defending ground he felt slipping under him. Hammer. 6, he repeated, letting the name drip with mock amusement. What is that supposed to be, some old war story? A few younger officers gave uncertain smiles, relieved by the attempt to restore order. But the older captain near the rear table did not smile. Captain Leonard Pierce had gone pale. His hand, resting on a stack of briefing papers, had tightened so hard the knuckles showed white. He had served 30 years and buried enough ghosts to know when one had walked back into the room. Walter Kane did not answer Ethan's ridicule. He simply stepped back from the illuminated chart and folded his hands behind him, posture easy, almost indifferent. The stillness unsettled Ethan more than defiance would have. Men argued when challenged. This man absorbed challenge as if it meant nothing. Sir, Ethan said louder, aware of eyes on him now, you are disrupting a United States naval briefing with some invented call sign and unsolicited opinions. Walter tilted his head slightly, studying the younger officer with a look almost paternal. Invented things do not stay buried for 60 years, he said. The room seemed colder. At the communications station, Lieutenant Noah Mercer felt a pulse in his throat. Hammer 6. The phrase tugged at some forgotten archive briefing, some declassified fragment he had skimmed during intelligence rotation and dismissed as Cold War folklore. His fingers moved almost unconsciously across the secure terminal beside him. He opened a restricted naval heritage database, entering 2 words with sudden urgency. Nothing appeared at first. Then a security warning blinked. Access limited. Flag review required. Noah's breath caught. Ethan had not noticed. He was too busy reclaiming authority. He pointed toward the door. Escort him out. No one moved. Even the Marine security sergeant by the hatch hesitated. Walter glanced once at the map again, then toward the windows where gray Pacific light pressed against reinforced glass. Current shifts 2 knots west in this season, he said quietly. It fools men who trust screens more than water. Ethan stepped forward, anger rising now from embarrassment. You will stop speaking in riddles. Walter's gaze met his. It was not a riddle in 1968. That was when Captain Pierce finally spoke, voice low, almost unwilling. Commander, where did you hear that call sign? Ethan turned, irritated. Hear what? Pierce swallowed. Hammer 6. The name sounded heavier in another man's mouth. A silence followed so dense it seemed to muffle the hum of electronics. Noah Mercer looked up from his terminal, face drained of color. On the screen a dormant file had unlocked one line in red lettering, Operation Hammer 6, flag level historical access only. Noah rose so abruptly his chair rolled backward. He should have spoken aloud. Instead, instinct older than protocol took over. He reached for the secure line beside the terminal, the red handset reserved for direct flag command traffic. His hand hovered 1 second before lifting it. Across the room Ethan was still speaking, still trying to contain a moment already slipping beyond him. But Noah no longer heard him. As the encrypted line began to ring somewhere deep in the Admiral's compound, Walter Kane stood under the red tactical light as motionless as an old monument, and for the first time several officers in that room began to wonder whether they were not standing in the presence of history itself. The red handset felt heavier than it should have in Lieutenant Noah Mercer's hand. Its coiled cord stretched taut as he turned slightly away from the room, shielding the call with his shoulder while the encrypted line pulsed in low mechanical clicks. Around him the briefing chamber had become a theater of strained stillness. Commander Ethan Cole stood rigid beside the illuminated operations table, every inch of him resisting the invisible shift in authority he could feel but did not yet understand. Walter Kane remained where he was, one weathered hand resting lightly on the edge of the map, as calm as if he were standing on a quiet pier instead of inside the nerve center of the Pacific Fleet. Then the line opened. A clipped voice answered from Flag Command. Office of Admiral Whitaker. Noah lowered his voice. Lieutenant Mercer, Fleet Intelligence. I need immediate verification on a restricted historical call. Sign. Irritation came first. Lieutenant, the Admiral is in closed brief. Noah looked across the room at Walter Kane, then spoke the two words that made his own pulse jump. Hammer 6. Silence answered. Not static. Silence. Even over encrypted circuits, it had weight. Then the voice return changed, stripped of bureaucracy. Repeat that call sign. Noah did. This time there was no response at all, only the sound of a receiver abruptly set down. In the briefing room Ethan had begun talking again, voice too loud, pushing protocol as if words alone could force reality back into shape. Lieutenant, hang up that line. This briefing proceeds now. But Noah did not move. Across the table Captain Pierce's gaze had gone distant, as though memory itself had begun walking through the room. His fingers drifted unconsciously to a faded campaign ribbon on his chest. Walter noticed, but said nothing. The old man's silence seemed almost deliberate now, as though he knew events had reached a point where explanation was no longer his burden. Then, without warning, a memory stirred behind his pale eyes. For a moment the red tactical glow became another red entirely, filtered through storm clouds over black Pacific water decades earlier. He saw signal lamps cutting through rain. A compass card trembling under salt spray. Young faces looking toward him in a steel-walled combat information center while currents twisted beneath a destroyer's keel. He heard a younger voice over cracked radio speakers say, Hammer 6, recommend course correction 27 degrees. He remembered not fear, but the discipline of men trusting one calm decision in bad water. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. Back in the present Ethan stepped closer again, unable to bear the old man's composure. Who are you really? He demanded. Walter looked at him almost sadly. Someone who warned your route was wrong. Before Ethan could answer, the secure hatch at the rear of the briefing room opened. Not dramatically. Quietly. Yet the effect was electric. A senior communications chief entered at a near run, breath tight, eyes wide. He moved straight to Ethan and whispered something in his ear. Color drained from the commander's face. That is impossible, Ethan muttered. The chief only shook his head once. Admiral Whitaker is coming here. Now. The words moved through the room like a pressure wave. Chairs scraped. Officers straightened instinctively. Somewhere down the corridor came the measured rhythm of approaching footsteps, polished shoes striking deck steel with the cadence of command. Noah slowly replaced the red handset, hand trembling now despite himself. At the operations table Walter Kane glanced once toward the hatch, not surprised, only faintly weary, as if old debts had a habit of arriving on schedule. Outside the reinforced windows gulls wheeled above gray Pacific swells. Inside, no one spoke. The room that had mocked an old man minutes earlier now waited in a silence so complete even the hum of the projectors seemed intrusive. And in that gathering stillness, Commander Ethan Cole began, for the first time, to suspect he had challenged a name the Navy had never forgotten. The footsteps stopped outside the hatch, and for one suspended second the entire briefing room seemed to hold its breath. Then the door opened. Admiral Thomas Whitaker entered without entourage, without announcement, yet his presence struck the room with the force of a sudden weather front. Every officer rose instinctively. Chairs scraped across the deck in one ragged motion, and the rustle of uniforms snapped into silence. Whitaker was a hard-faced man in his late 60s, silver hair close-cropped, shoulders still carrying the bearing of sea command. His eyes did not go to Commander Ethan Cole, nor to the glowing operations map. They went straight to Walter Kane. The old man had not moved. For a moment no one spoke, and what passed between the two men seemed older than rank. Whitaker crossed the room in measured steps. Ethan opened his mouth, perhaps to explain, perhaps to defend himself, but the Admiral lifted one hand and silenced him without looking. It was the kind of gesture that did not need force because authority had long ago settled into habit. Whitaker stopped 2 feet from Walter Kane. The room watched. Noah Mercer felt his heartbeat in his ears. Captain Pierce stood rigid, eyes shining with a recognition almost reverent. Then the Admiral did something no one in the room expected. He came to attention. Perfectly. Spine straight, chin level, the old ceremonial precision of a generation raised under different steel. And he saluted. The sound was not loud, only the whisper of cloth moving, but it landed like thunder. Ethan Cole went pale. One junior officer at the rear looked as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Walter regarded the salute a moment, then returned it, not with flourish but with the quiet economy of a man for whom ceremony had once meant survival. Whitaker lowered his hand. His voice, when it came, was low enough that the room leaned toward it. I wondered if I would ever hear that call sign spoken aloud again. Ethan found his voice first, though it came strained. Sir, this civilian entered a classified brief and interfered with operational planning. Whitaker turned slowly, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Civilian, he said. One word. Nothing more. Yet Ethan's protest collapsed under it. The Admiral stepped to the illuminated map. Walter's earlier alternate route still glowed faintly where his finger had traced it. Whitaker studied it and gave the slightest nod. Shift the carrier group 2.7 degrees west, he said to operations staff. Use Kane's channel. Pens moved. Orders were repeated. A plan built by software and reviewed by command dissolved in seconds because one old man had touched a chart. No one questioned it. Then Whitaker looked back at Walter, and the hard edge in his expression softened into something almost private. You still read currents by instinct. Walter allowed the ghost of a smile. Screens still lie. A few quiet laughs rose, nervous and odd. But Ethan stood motionless, the humiliation of earlier now hanging over him heavier than reprimand. Whitaker noticed. Commander Cole. Ethan snapped upright. Yes, sir. The Admiral regarded him a long second. There is a difference between guarding a room and understanding who belongs in it. No shouting. No public dressing down. Only the sentence, delivered with the weight of iron. Silent military justice. It settled deeper than anger could. Then Whitaker turned to the room. For those too young to know, Walter Kane carried a call sign retired from public record because too many men owed their lives to it. No one moved. No one dared. Outside, the Pacific rolled under a gray noon sky as it had for generations. Inside, beneath the red tactical lights, the briefing had become something else entirely. Not a meeting. A reckoning. And as Walter Kane stepped once more toward the glowing chart, every eye in that room followed the old man they had mistaken for a relic, while history, long buried beneath protocol, stood breathing in plain sight. No one sat back down until Admiral Whitaker gave a slight nod, and even then the room settled with a different gravity than before. The briefing had resumed, but it no longer belonged to charts and algorithms alone. It revolved around Walter Kane, who now stood beside the illuminated operations table while younger officers leaned toward every quiet word he offered. He traced a weather seam moving across the western Pacific, explaining how cold currents curled beneath warmer surface drift, how a carrier group could appear stable on a digital model yet wander miles off projected timing by dawn. His finger moved over the map with the certainty of long memory. He did not speak like a lecturer. He spoke like a man recalling something alive. Lieutenant Noah Mercer watched in astonishment as staff officers who had dismissed him an hour earlier began adjusting routes at his suggestion without hesitation. Even Captain Pierce, old enough to carry his own legends, listened as though hearing an elder mariner reading tides from the stars. Only Commander Ethan Cole remained still, his face set in rigid silence. The polished certainty that had armored him all morning had cracked, though pride still kept him upright. Whitaker noticed, but said nothing. He understood some lessons deepened only in quiet. Walter pointed to a narrow island passage glowing amber on the display. That choke point looks efficient, he said, until a storm wall rolls in from the north. Then it becomes a trap for men who think speed outruns weather. The phrase landed strangely. Trap for men who think speed outruns weather. Several officers exchanged glances and scribbled notes. Yet Whitaker had gone still. His eyes were no longer on the map but somewhere decades beyond it. For a breath, the briefing room dissolved for him into memory. A younger Whitaker, then a raw lieutenant, standing in heavy rain on a destroyer bridge while instruments failed in a Pacific squall. A voice over radio static, gravel calm amid confusion. Hammer 6 advising a turn no one wanted to make. The course correction that saved a task force from sailing blind into disaster. Whitaker blinked and the memory faded, but something unresolved had risen with it. He stepped closer to Walter. You never told them what happened after the channel crossing. Walter gave a faint, weathered smile. Some things stayed where they belonged. But Whitaker shook his head. Not today. The Admiral turned toward the room. Most of you think his call sign belongs to a legend. It belonged to a man who once corrected my command when I was too young to know I was wrong. Silence answered him. Ethan Cole looked up sharply. Whitaker's voice grew softer, and somehow stronger. I was 24. I argued exactly as you argued this morning. His eyes flicked briefly to Ethan, not cruelly, almost mercifully. I was certain rank meant understanding. A few officers lowered their gaze. The lesson cut wider than one man. Then Whitaker did something unexpected. He pulled a chair from the head of the briefing table, the Admiral's own seat, and stepped aside. Walter, he said, take the chair. A murmur moved through the room, stunned and reverent. In military culture there were honors spoken aloud, and there were honors understood without words. This was the second kind. Walter hesitated. Thomas, Whitaker's expression hardened just enough to end protest. That is not a request. A quiet ripple of restrained smiles moved across the room. Walter Kane sat at the head of Pacific Fleet strategy table while admirals and commanders stood around him awaiting instruction. Commander Ethan Cole watched it happen as if witnessing the inversion of gravity itself. No reprimand could have humbled him more. Yet what struck him deepest was not shame. It was dawning respect. Walter looked once around the table, at faces young enough to be grandchildren, then rested his hands beside the glowing map. All right, he said softly, let us keep your ships out of bad water. And in that moment the room no longer saw an old man tolerated by history. It saw a master invited back to teach. For the next hour the briefing no longer moved by doctrine but by memory sharpened into instinct. Walter Kane sat at the head of the table, one weathered finger guiding carrier routes through currents no algorithm had accounted for, while officers twice and three times removed from his generation adjusted live operational planning in silence. The room had transformed into something older than a modern command center. It felt, to more than one man present, like a wardroom from another era where seamanship still carried the weight of scripture. Admiral Whitaker remained standing beside Walter rather than reclaiming his own chair, an act every officer in the room understood without discussion. It was not courtesy. It was deference. Commander Ethan Cole stood near the projection wall, hands clasped behind his back, listening as Walter explained how storm pressure often bent convoy logic in ways computers treated as statistical noise. Water does not care about confidence, Walter said quietly. It only respects attention. The word struck Ethan harder than any reprimand. He had spent years believing mastery meant speed, precision, command presence. Yet this old man, dismissed as an intruder an hour ago, carried authority without displaying any need for it. The realization unsettled him more than humiliation ever could. Then the briefing shifted. A communications officer entered carrying an updated satellite weather package and laid it beside Walter. He studied the printout, eyes narrowing. There, he said, tapping a pressure seam east of Okinawa. That front accelerates faster than your model predicts. Analysts checked. He was right. Again. A murmur of restrained disbelief moved around the room. Lieutenant Noah Mercer caught himself smiling. Captain Pierce only exhaled. Slowly, as though watching prophecy prove ordinary. Whitaker folded his arms. "Tell them what your navigator taught you," he said. Walter was silent a long moment. Then his gaze drifted toward the reinforced windows where Pacific light had softened toward late afternoon silver. "He said men lose ships when they confuse machinery with judgment." He paused. He was right. There was a weight behind the sentence, and some in the room sensed another story buried beneath it. Ethan did too. Before he could stop himself, he stepped forward. "Sir." The word was directed not to the Admiral but to Walter Kane. It landed awkward, almost unfamiliar. Several heads turned. Ethan swallowed once, the movement visible in his rigid throat. "Earlier. I was wrong." The room grew still. No one expected it. Pride rarely yielded in public, least of all in uniform. Walter regarded him a long moment. Then he nodded once, accepting the apology with no ceremony. "You defended your room," he said. "Now learn who belongs in it." It was not rebuke. It was invitation. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, and something in him changed. Not broken. Reoriented. Whitaker watched the exchange with the faintest trace of approval. This, too, was justice. Not punishment, but correction through dignity. Then an aide approached the Admiral and whispered. Whitaker listened, frowned, then looked to Walter. "They have assembled the senior flag officers upstairs for the Joint Pacific Review." He paused. "They heard who is here." A few officers exchanged startled looks. Whitaker's mouth twitched with dry amusement. "They are asking if Hammer 6 will brief them personally." Noah almost laughed aloud at the absurdity of it. The legend summoned upward through the chain of command as if recalled from retirement by history itself. Walter leaned back slightly in the Admiral's chair, weary but amused. "I came to correct one bad route," he said. Whitaker answered, "You may leave with half the Pacific rethinking theirs." Quiet laughter moved through the room. Even Ethan smiled. Outside, gulls rode the wind over darkening water while inside, under softened tactical lights, men who had entered that room certain of rank and hierarchy now found themselves gathered around an old sailor whose wisdom had bent command itself. And as Walter rose from the Admiral's chair to follow Whitaker toward the upper command deck, every officer in that room stood again, not from protocol this time, but from respect freely given. The upper command deck sat 2 levels above fleet operations, a chamber rarely entered except by flag officers and national command liaisons, where walls of live oceanic data shimmered beneath dim blue light and every word spoken could bend movements across thousands of miles. As Admiral Whitaker and Walter Kane stepped through the secured doors, conversation inside stopped with the strange precision of a room trained to silence itself. Around the long oval table sat admirals from carrier strike groups, submarine command, and Joint Pacific Planning, silver stars catching the glow of digital charts. Many had risen before the hatch fully shut. Some stared openly. Others looked at Walter with the quiet recognition reserved for names once spoken only in wardrooms and classified oral histories. Whitaker did not take the head seat. Again he stepped aside. "Gentlemen," he said, voice carrying without effort, "you asked whether Hammer 6 would brief you." A pause. Then, almost dryly, "He is here." The room remained still enough to hear ventilation whisper through deck grates. Walter looked almost uncomfortable beneath so much attention. His old field jacket seemed even more ordinary against a ring of stars and ribbons. Yet when he approached the central strategic projection and studied the Pacific spread beneath glass, the unease left him. It was as though the map itself returned him to native ground. An admiral from 7th Fleet leaned forward. "Sir," he said, using the word naturally, "we have reviewed your route correction. We would like your assessment of the Eastern Carrier Corridor." Walter rested one hand on the glowing table. It is too rigid. No preamble. No ornament. Your formations assume the ocean behaves politely. A ripple of restrained smiles moved around the table. Then he began. He spoke of pressure seams, seasonal drift, convoy psychology, and why men under stress favored predictable mistakes. He spoke not in abstractions but in images. Water folding against shoals. Radar trusting clean horizons that weather could distort. The way experience sometimes heard danger before instruments named it. Officers who had spent decades commanding fleets listened like cadets. Commander Ethan Cole stood at the back beside Noah Mercer, saying nothing. Yet Noah saw something in Ethan's face he had not seen before, wonder stripped of defensiveness. At one point a rear admiral challenged an alternate route through a narrow maritime gap. Walter listened, nodded, and reached for a grease pencil. He drew a slight curve through the projection. Barely a deviation. You move 12 nautical miles west here, he said, and your vulnerability disappears. Analysts ran it through the system. A civilian consultant at a side console looked up first, stunned. That reduces exposure by 30%. Quiet astonishment swept the room. One admiral gave a low whistle. Another leaned back and murmured, "Good Lord." But Whitaker only watched Walter with a look deeper than admiration. It was repayment. At length, when questions slowed, an older four-star seated near the far end cleared his throat. "Walter," he said, "not sir, not Mr. Kane, but Walter," as if reaching across 50 years. "Do you know how many officers still study the channel correction you made in '68? Walter did not answer immediately. He looked down at the glowing Pacific, expression touched by old fatigue. "I thought they buried that with the files." The admiral shook his head. "Some things cannot be buried." Then, to the astonishment of every younger officer present, he rose. Slowly, deliberately. Others followed. One by one around the oval table, admirals stood. Not for protocol. For tribute. Commander Ethan Cole felt the hairs rise on his arms as an entire generation of command honored a man he had tried to remove from a briefing room that morning. Walter looked almost pained by the gesture. "Sit down before you embarrass me," he muttered, and laughter broke the tension like sunlight through cloud. Yet in that laughter lived reverence. As the officers resumed their seats, Whitaker leaned toward Ethan without taking his eyes off Walter. "Remember this," he said quietly. "Competence can command obedience. Character commands memory." Ethan said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. He was watching legacy made visible. When the laughter faded, the upper command deck settled into a quieter kind of gravity, the kind that comes after men realize they have witnessed something that will be spoken of long after the room is empty. Walter Kane remained near the glowing strategic table, one hand resting lightly on its edge as officers resumed their seats with a deference that no regulation could compel. Yet the atmosphere had changed again. It was no longer simply admiration for forgotten mastery. It had become something closer to restoration. Admiral Whitaker exchanged a glance with the senior four-star at the far end, and some silent understanding passed between them. Then Whitaker turned toward Commander Ethan Cole. "Front and center, Commander." The words were calm, almost conversational, but they carried through the chamber. Ethan stepped forward, pulse rising though his face stayed composed. He stopped beside the table, aware of every eye in the room. Whitaker studied him for a long second, not as an officer assessing failure, but as a man deciding how to shape a lesson. "This morning," he said, "you challenged a man whose name is taught in command circles you have not yet entered." Ethan swallowed. "Yes, sir." Whitaker nodded once. "And today you learned what most officers learn too late." He turned, gesturing toward Walter. "Authority can be worn. Respect must be earned." No one moved. The room seemed suspended on the sentence. Then, to Ethan's astonishment, Whitaker stepped back. "Commander Cole," he said, "you owe Mr. Kane something no admiral can order." Ethan understood. For one brief instant embarrassment flashed across his face, then something steadier replaced it. He turned fully toward Walter Kane. The young commander who had mocked him in the briefing room that morning now came to attention with a precision sharpened by humility, and rendered a salute. Not because protocol required it. Because conscience did. Walter looked almost saddened by the necessity, then slowly returned it. "That will do, Commander," he said quietly. But Ethan did not lower his hand at once. His voice, when it came, held none of its former hardness. "Sir, I judged by appearance and rank. I was wrong." It was the second apology of the day, but this one carried the gravity of witness. In front of admirals and war planners, a young officer had laid pride down. No reprimand could have cut deeper. Yet Walter answered not with triumph, but grace. "Then you learned faster than most." A faint murmur of approval moved around the table. Silent justice, complete not through humiliation, but transformation. The senior four-star rose again, reaching into a leather portfolio beside him. From it he withdrew a framed black-and-white photograph, edges worn with age. He handed it to Ethan. "Show him." Ethan looked down. It was a destroyer bridge in storm spray, young officers blurred in grainy silver, and at the center a younger Walter Kane beside a lieutenant unmistakably recognizable as a young Thomas Whitaker. Across the bottom, handwritten in faded ink, "Trust the man who reads the sea." Ethan stared, speechless. Whitaker said softly, "Keep it in your office." The symbolism landed on everyone present. Legacy was not being remembered. It was being handed forward. Then an aide entered quietly and whispered to Whitaker that a formal dinner awaited downstairs. The Admiral waved it off. "It can wait." He looked at Walter. "There is one more thing." He motioned toward the head seat of the upper command table, reserved by custom for the ranking admiral present. "Sit there." Walter frowned. "You have made enough theater for one day." But the senior four-star smiled. "No theater. A debt." After a long reluctant breath, Walter sat. Around him, stars and ribbons ringed the old sailor as though command itself had closed ranks around forgotten valor. Ethan stood at the rear, no longer ashamed, only altered. Noah Mercer glanced toward him and saw it clearly. The challenger had become the witness. Outside the high reinforced windows dusk gathered over the Pacific in silver-blue bands, and inside that rarefied chamber of power, the old man once dismissed as an interruption now occupied the seat of highest honor, while those who had once commanded fleets listened for whatever he chose to say next. By the time the final discussion ended, night had settled over the Pacific, and the great windows of the upper command deck reflected more of the room than the dark water beyond. The strategic displays had dimmed to standby glow. Coffee cups sat forgotten beside briefing folders. Yet no one seemed eager to leave. Men accustomed to measuring time in schedules and operations lingered in the rare stillness that follows something unrepeatable. Walter Kane remained in the head chair longer than he wished, answering a last question here, offering a quiet correction there, until even the youngest officers had stopped seeing an old veteran and begun seeing a standard. At last he pushed back from the table. "That is enough wisdom for one day," he said dryly, and a soft wave of laughter moved through the room. Admirals rose again, though less formally now, as old friends might stand when a respected guest prepares to go. Admiral Whitaker stepped beside Walter and, for the first time all day, looked almost reluctant. "I will have a car take you home." Walter adjusted the cuff of his worn jacket. "I drove myself." Whitaker smiled. "Of course you did." Commander Ethan Cole moved forward before Walter could turn away. In his hands he carried a new leather folio embossed with the Pacific Fleet crest. "Sir," he said, the word now carrying effortless respect, "the route revisions you made today. I had them printed and annotated." He offered the folio almost awkwardly. "For your records." Walter took it, surprised. His thumb brushed the crest. You did not have to do this. Ethan shook his head. I think I did. There was no ceremony in the exchange, only something quieter and truer. Noah Mercer watched and understood the real reversal had never been rank bowing to legend. It was arrogance becoming stewardship. As Walter and Whitaker walked toward the hatch, the senior four-star who had produced the old photograph called after him. Hammer 6. Walter turned. Yes. The Admiral held up 2 fingers in an old naval signal of respect and said, Fair seas. Walter nodded once. Fair seas. The phrase hung in the room like a benediction. Down in fleet operations, officers who had heard rumors of the day's events lined the corridor without being told. No order had summoned them. Yet as Walter Kane walked slowly toward the elevator beside Admiral Whitaker, men and women in uniform stood aside in silence, some coming to attention, others simply lowering their heads as he passed. Commander Ethan Cole stood among them. When Walter paused before entering the elevator, he looked at Ethan one last time. You guard the room well, Commander. Ethan answered, I will guard it better now. The elevator doors closed. The old man was gone. But the silence he left behind was heavier than applause. Weeks later a framed black and white photograph appeared in Ethan Cole's office, the same storm-swept destroyer bridge with the faded handwritten line beneath it, Trust the man who reads the sea. Visitors often asked about it. Ethan would only say, that was the day I met a legend and learned the difference between authority and honor. And on the updated Pacific route charts approved after that briefing, one narrow correction remained permanently marked in internal shorthand among navigators, almost as a private tribute. Kane's turn. Sailors who used it often never knew why it bore that name. They only knew it kept them out of bad water. Somewhere beyond the base, Walter Kane returned to his quiet life, carrying no new medals, asking for no recognition, content as he had always been to let usefulness matter more than fame. But in one sealed archive at Pacific Fleet, a dormant historical file was reopened and amended with a final notation entered by Admiral Whitaker himself. Hammer 6. Active in memory. And perhaps that was enough. Because some names do not endure through noise or monuments. They endure because, when spoken in the right room, they make powerful men rise. Respect is not demanded. It survives in memory.